Thank you again for inviting me. My talk this afternoon is on brain death, controversies, consensus and controversies. There we go. And what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is focus on some areas of consensus of this topic, particularly the medical acceptance of it, the legal acceptance, and the successful organ donation system that has developed around the world using brain-dead people as donors. Then I'll focus on some of the remaining areas of controversy. The major one that I'll address today is the soundness of the biophilosophical justification for the equivalency of brain death and human death. I'll also talk a little bit about sensitivity and specificity of clinical and imaging tests, and make a few comments about, at least in the United States, how we accommodate religious and emotional disagreement with the diagnosis, and then I'll end with some future directions. Let me start by saying a few words about the history of this topic. And these two professors, Molleret and Goulon from Paris, wrote this paper called Le Coma dépassé in the Revue Neurologique in 1959, and it's been generally regarded as the first comprehensive description of what later came to be called brain death. Then in 1968, and Harvard Medical School in Boston, Henry Beecher, an anesthesiologist, chaired a faculty committee at Harvard University, professors, for the first time stating what the criteria are for diagnosing brain death, and unfortunately titled their paper in JAMA in 1968, A Definition of Irreversible Coma, but then it went on to say, a report of the ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death. And they also popularized the term brain death, which is not a great term. What we mean by this is the irreversible cessation of all the brain's clinical functions. And then when that is reliably determined, it constitutes human death. And it's a misleading term because people hearing it, and it's translated into various languages, morte cerebrale, et cetera, that suggests that it's only the brain that dies rather than it's the death of the human being. But it's been accepted by physicians and society throughout the developed world and much of the developing world, though survey studies continue to show that there is confusion in exactly what this means by both physicians and laypersons. As a general rule, it's accepted better by physicians than by families, which, in my observation, is the opposite of circulatory death or asystolic death, which seems to be better accepted by families than by physicians. And I may come back to that later. In the United States, we have what we call the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which was a federal model statute, and the 50 states in the United States all adopted either this statute or a close relative of it. And it states that an individual who has sustained either one, irreversible cessation of circulation and respiratory functions, or two, irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. A determination of death must be made in accordance with accepted medical standards. So it allows physicians the license to choose one of two ways to determine death. And the way it works out in practice is if the patient is not receiving ventilatory support and no ventilatory support is planned, then the part one is fulfilled. If the patient is on a ventilator and can't breathe, then part two, looking directly at brain function, needs to be tested. Our statute, which I was a critic of when it was published in 1981, doesn't make clear what the relationship is between the two seemingly independent criteria of death. And my colleagues and I wrote a paper about this, published the same year as the statute was. We had some advance notice, and they saw our paper, and it kind of went back and forth. But that it's the neurological criteria, that is the brain, that is the fundamental criterion of death, or so-called brain death, and that the circulatory respiratory criterion of death becomes valid because if there is no cardiopulmonary resuscitation or any ventilatory support, it leads to fulfilling the brain criterion because the brain is irreversibly destroyed by lack of circulation. And that only in the presence of respiration and circulatory support is the brain criterion tested. Internationally, brain death is present in all states in the United States, Canada, throughout Europe, throughout the developed world, and in much of the developing world. And in a survey done in 2002, it was said to be practiced in more than 80 countries. A repeat survey I've cited here by Sarah Wolster, published last year in Neurology, showed that it was practiced in more countries, but it was a kind of difficult thing. Some of them had laws, some had practices, some had this, some had that. It was a mixture of different things, but suffice it to say, it's internationally accepted. Despite that, it continues to have critics, skeptics, who say that these people are not dead, they're severely brain damaged but not dead. Yet those critiques, whatever their value, have not gained traction with the public or professional societies or any places any jurisdictions that define laws. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Within Europe, it's accepted, there are 28 European countries surveyed in this paper published in Neurocritical Care in 2014. And the authors, after receiving the survey of the countries that were surveyed, said that there was a strong consensus throughout Europe that brain death equals death, human death, and that the criteria, and there are a number of different published criteria, the ones we use are the American Academy of Neurology criteria, and those were cited by the authors of this paper, and that those were valid criteria. But there were differences among the European countries in what prerequisites were necessary for physicians to determine before making a diagnosis of brain death, the number of examinations that was necessary for brain death determination, and the interval between successive examinations, and the use of ancillary tests, things showing absence of brain electrical activity or cessation of brain blood flow. Those differed. And they concluded by underscoring the desirability of determining an international consensus. And I abstracted a few figures from that paper, and this looked at the prerequisites, and it shows that the endocrine status is not required in about half of countries. Normal blood pressure is not. But when you get down here to things like absence of sedatives and paralytics, these are drugs that, if given in therapeutic dosage, could create a state mimicking brain death, and their absence is absolutely necessary. And the good news is that those also are absolutely necessary. But you see that some of the other prerequisites vary in their usage. And then the question about whether there's a legal basis for this and whether they dictate which specialists can perform brain death is defined in about 2/3 of countries and not defined in the other third. And this is a graph from the paper that shows the minimum observation time between the examinations for brain death. There would be Q1 and Q2, and you see it varies between 2 and 6 hours. And these are the specialists who are credentialed, if you will, or permitted to be involved in brain death determinations, intensivists, neurologists, neurosurgeons, and then a few others. By contrast, in the United States, it's almost exclusively restricted to neurologists, neurosurgeons, and intensivists. A few words about brain death in Spain, and Soterio's paper, Neurocritical Care, was my reference. It's accepted medically and legally. Ancillary tests are not required. 2 examinations must be performed and separated by at least 6 hours. An apnea test defines the arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide required. And for those of you not familiar with this medical jargon, the level of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream has to rise beyond a certain level in order to maximally stimulate the part of the brain that controls breathing. And when patients are in intensive care units, usually that pressure is kept very low because it helps the brain. So there's a process in which, during the testing, you safely allow that level of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream to rise until it reaches a point that would maximally stimulate the brain to breathe. And only when it's at that level and the brain is stimulated maximally and there's no breathing effort can you say that there's no breathing at all. Back to the list here, 3 physicians involved in death determination, and as all of you know, a very robust program of organ donation has increased rates following the publication of guidelines. And this is Maten's paper from Lancet looking at when the guidelines were phased in here, and the number of donors has gone up so that the presence of those guidelines is certainly helpful. This was kind of an interesting 2 studies that I found that was looking at this question of what does the public know about brain death? Physicians generally know about it, but what about the public? And these were both published in the journal called Transplantation Proceedings, references at the bottom. And the first one surveyed over 3,000 adolescents and found that 38% knew about the concept and said that, yes, indeed, a brain-dead person is dead. 54% were unaware of it, and 8% said the person were aware of it but said the person was not dead. Then a similar survey was conducted among secondary school teachers, and here about 2/3 of the teachers knew about the concept and said the person was dead. About 1/3 said they were unaware of the concept, and 3% said that the person was not dead. So there's obviously some educational work that needs to be done, not only in Spain, the United States. I'm sure we have similar data about this, and I think that it is, as a rule, not terribly well understood by the public. Many people have what I call an intuitive acceptance of brain death, and that is that although surveys do confirm that they don't understand any of the technical parts of it, or even maybe the definition of it, they tend to think it makes sense. And that's on an intuitive level. The academic disputes persist, but critics for over 40 years have not succeeded in changing the laws anywhere. And in a recent survey, and this is by David Rodriguez Arias from Madrid, a recent survey shows that medical professionals say it is more reliable than circulatory death. Now, I want to just show a couple of brief slides reviewing papers. Eric Racine and his group in Montreal in the Journal of Medical Ethics published this study 2 years ago looking at the accuracy of depictions of brain death in print media. And they reviewed 940 articles in leading United States and Canadian newspapers. In the United States, things like the New York Times and the Washington Post that are generally regarded as authoritative. And they were interested in the words that the journalists used when referring to people who were brain dead, and discovered that it was used colloquially in 39%, but defined only in 3% of Canadian papers and 2.7% of USA papers. And these are among the finest papers we have, so one would imagine that in the other groups of newspapers, they weren't as good. They found that brain death was the determination of death that was noted as that, and only less than 10%. In other words, they used the term, but they didn't say that this means the person is dead. That was only stated explicitly in fewer than 10% of cases. And that organ donation was mentioned in 1/3 of cases in Canada and about 21% in the United States. Another popular way of looking at the depiction of brain death is in film and television, and this was a subject of a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation that's been e-published, but it isn't in print yet, and I have a citation here by Ariana Lewis and colleagues. And she and her senior colleague reviewed 24 productions of 160,000 in the Paley Center for Media. This is a big database of film and television shows. and in the 3.7 million within the Internet Movie Database, which is a wonderful database of feature-length movies, imdb.com, I think. And they have screening techniques so you can put in words and pull up things. And they found 24 of this large database were brain death that was depicted in a film or on television. And they found that none demonstrated a complete neurological examination for brain death. Only 2 of the 24 depicted an apnea test, that's for not breathing, which is absolutely necessary for the diagnosis. Only 13% provided an accurate understanding. And organ donation, although it was mentioned in 71, how it was mentioned, and they had criteria for what they called professional discussion, which is the way donor coordinators and transplant nurses do it. It was present in only 9% of film and 27% of television. So again, some of the public confusion about this may be the product of misinformation through popular media, both film, television, and print. This was the same from that paper, and there were 2 people, Lewis and the other author, who looked at this question, and they asked the respondents a statement. After watching this production, I believe the public would have a complete and this is what they said, a complete and accurate understanding of brain death. So that when they were looking at how it was presented, they tested it according to that standard. And they found that they strongly disagreed in 2/3 of the cases in one person and 58 in the other. And you see the other things. So not a very promising situation. All right, well, let's look at some other avenues of public discourse and belief systems and how they look at brain death. And I'd like to say a few words about the religious acceptance of brain death, which is itself a large topic and one that I've given a lecture on, a whole lecture on all the different religions, but we don't have time for that. So I'm going to focus on Roman Catholicism here and tell you some interesting things about that. And that is that historically, the Catholic Church regarded death determination as solely a medical issue and not one on which the Church felt they had any relevant claim. And Pope Pius XII, in a statement to anesthesiologists in 1957, made this very explicit. But what happened is, after 1957 was the advent of brain death. And brain death is based on an idea. And that idea is that when the brain is completely absent of all function, and that absence is irreversible, it doesn't matter that the heart is still beating, the blood is circulating, the kidneys are filtering, and the liver is doing its thing. And once it was clear to the decision makers in the Vatican that there was some conceptual kernel to the idea of brain death, and it wasn't solely a medical determination at the bedside. Obviously, the technical part was medical, but it was based on a conceptual idea. They decided it was time for the Church to have a look at it. It was stimulated by some claims made by opponents to brain death that patients in Catholic hospitals around the world were being killed who weren't dead, and their organs were being donated. So they got excited about that. And the Pope, John Paul II, appointed a task force of the Vatican Pontifical Academy for Life, which is a relatively new pontifical academy. And in 1997 and 1998, a group of 10 people who were experts on this, and I participated in this, which is very interesting, over a 2-year period, 4 visits to the Vatican, living there and discussing it with the officials there. And it was a very fair debate between the opponents, on which that's the side I was on, and the opponents. And it culminated in the Pope making a statement in August of 2000 to a group of transplant surgeons who were visiting Rome, saying that the Church found it acceptable, essentially. And after the Pope died, Pope Benedict, the successor pope, reopened the question after much pressure being brought to bear. And another group, and I was in that group also, went to the Vatican in 2006 and had somewhat of a repeat of the previous arguments that led to endorsement. And that was done rather than by the Vatican Pontifical Academy for Life. The Pontifical Academy of Science is a much older pontifical academy, and it looks more at scientific things. Here are some pictures I took. This is the Casa Santa Marta, which is where we stayed when we were visiting there, and is where the current Pope resides, interestingly enough. And this was, and they name their pontifical academies in Latin, Pontificia Academia Pro Vita, for the 2-year period that we did our work. And this was after the Pope's address. The head of the Pontifical Academy sent each of us a letter thanking us, and included this copy of John Paul's address to the 18th International Congress. And we can't go through the whole thing. It was a 3-page letter, but it basically says that they endorsed that. And then this is a picture I took in 2006 of the Vatican Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which was, the building was constructed in 1603, which is a beautiful marble building in which we met. And at the end of the session, the papers and commentary and so on were all published in this book called The Signs of Death, which is published by the Scriptivaria. It's Scriptivaria 110, if anybody's interested in looking this up. In fact, it's online. You can download the entire book if you want to. So at least it seems that there isn't an active debate going on now at the Vatican regarding the acceptance of brain death. I will note, however, that after Pope Benedict stepped down and Pope Francis stepped up, I haven't heard about any more activity there, so I'm not sure. I imagine he has other things to do than this, but or maybe they feel 2 is enough. So let's move on. In addition to some of the media issues and the religious dimensions that I described, I want to just focus a little bit on the subject material of the attacks leading to refinements. And I reviewed these in a paper a few years ago in Nature Reviews Neurology on the current controversies in the determination of death. And those include the choice of the definition of death, an imprecise correspondence between the definition and the criterion of death, perceived inadequacies of the whole brain criterion of death, and the impossibility of stating any uniform definition. We're going to come back to these as I go through this a little bit. One of the main critics has been Alan Schumann, who's a pediatric neurologist at UCLA, member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and someone who was invited to both of the Vatican groups and went over there all the times that I did. And he claims that and he was on the other side of the equation, obviously, that it's not what we mean by death, and that the integration theory of why brain dead people are dead is a fallacy because integration occurs outside the brain. And if anybody's interested in reading any of these, which I think are useful to read, if you pull up my paper, I have them all cited and somewhat of a rebuttal. It's hard to do a detailed rebuttal in a review paper. Some other critics believe in the higher brain formulation. This means that it isn't the entire brain that has to be destroyed, only the cortex, so that people in vegetative states like those whom we discussed this morning, according to the higher brain criterion of death, would be diagnosed as dead. And I'll just note that there isn't a jurisdiction anywhere in the world that agrees with that. But some philosophers like Bob Veitch at Georgetown have written about this for a long time. Some feel, like Bob Trug in Boston, that it's an unnecessary anachronism that was developed in an era before we were allowed to withdraw life-sustaining treatment, and now that we are, it isn't necessary to do this. Others, like Bob Taylor at Ohio State University, refer to it as a legal fiction. That is something that we all know isn't true, but we kind of blink our eyes, wink, and go along with it in order to have organ donation. Some philosophers like McMahon and Lizza believe in more than one type of death. There's death of the body and death of the spirit, and those are separate, and they would okay with brain death as long as the body is concerned, but not the soul. And then Winston Chong from University of California at San Francisco has made arguments that there can be no uniform determination of human death. Basically, Schumann's critique was that the integration rationale that was cited by me and others in our defenses was inadequate. And in 2008, a United States Presidential Council took this up and decided that they were going to review it, and they concluded on the side of accepting brain death. But they agreed with Schumann that the integration rationale was inadequate, and they came up with a new one, which I didn't quite understand, but it was the inability of the organism to conduct its self-preserving work. And immediately Schumann fired back, saying that this group is committing the same fallacy that I did with the integration rationale. Has the same flaw. So we need better refinement of this concept of the organism as a whole, and I'm going to try to provide a little of that today. And I'm working on a paper with one of our Dartmouth medical students who has a degree in philosophy, and we're going back to the organism as a whole and restudying exactly what it means. In my study of this over the last 35 years, I've done what I refer to as a biophilosophical analysis, which is trying to break it down into its component sequential parts and then analyze what those are. And this was the reason that I got invited to the Vatican, because they thought that this analytic method was helpful in identifying where the disagreements were, really. So it starts with a paradigm which is preconditions that frame analysis, like death is primarily a biological phenomenon. Life is biological, death is biological. It's not primarily a social, religious, legal, cultural phenomenon, although it has all of those implications, particularly dying. But death itself is a biological thing. So there's a paradigm of preconditions. There's a definition of making explicit how we use the word in our ordinary language, because it's not a technical word, it's a common word. And making explicit our usage is what we will call the definition. The criterion is the general measurable standard showing that the definition is fulfilled that can go into a statute of death. And the tests are the procedures that physicians perform at the bedside to show that the criterion is fulfilled. And I said at the bottom of this that even many opponents concur, like Alan Schumann, concur that this is a useful analytic framework in which one can detect the locus of a disagreement. So the definition that my colleagues and I have come up with is the irreversible cessation of the critical functions of the organism as a whole, and I'm going to come back to what those are. The criterion showing that is fulfilled is the irreversible cessation of function of a critical number of neurons of the cerebral hemispheres and brainstem, which is known in the field as the whole brain formulation. And the tests are constantly being evolved, and currently in the United States at least, the American Academy of Neurology's adult test from 2010 and the Multi-Society Task Force on Brain Death in Infants and Children, who published their recommendations in 2011, are the current standard, but there are many others in different countries. This is just the ones that I know about. The whole brain criterion is the determination that it requires the irreversible cessation of the whole brain functions. The higher brain is popular in some academic circles. That's the one that would diagnose vegetative state patients as dead, not accepted anywhere. A brain stem criterion, so-called brain stem death, was developed by Christopher Pallas in the UK and published in the British Medical Journal and in his book, and accepted in the UK and in a few other places, that requires only the brain stem to be completely gone. So the whole brain requires the cessation of clinical functions, not neuronal activities. That means a clinical function is a more macroscopic function. It doesn't mean that a certain cell might still be alive somewhere that could be detected by some technology. It's only if that cell contributes to the possession of a clinical function that counts. And one of the benefits of the whole brain criterion is that it allows for the following. What often happens in brain death is there's a primary injury, say a massive traumatic brain injury, or a massive stroke, hemorrhage usually, often subarachnoid hemorrhage. And that destroys a lot of the brain, but it doesn't destroy all of the brain until the swelling created by the primary event causes intracranial pressure to rise. I mean, you think of the cranium as a closed volume sphere. It can't expand, at least not in an adult. The sutures between the cranial bones are fused. So if something additional gets delivered into the brain, like a big bolus of blood, then it has to increase the pressure because there's no place for it to go. And eventually that pressure exceeds mean arterial blood pressure. That's the pressure between systolic and diastolic systemic blood pressure. And when that happens, there's no more blood flow into the brain. And when there's no blood flow into the brain, then all of the neurons that weren't killed by the primary event are killed by the secondary increased intracranial pressure. And it leads to diffuse neuronal death. So that it's a way to confirm that this is widespread and includes the destruction of certain parts of the brain which we neurologists have difficulty in testing at the bedside. But we can be sure it's the case when we show that no blood is entering the cranial cavity. No cells can survive that. And ancillary tests are possible, and I don't know if I'm showing any of these or not, I don't think so today, but can show that there's no blood flow into the brain. Now, I wanted to get into, because of our audience, I didn't want to make it as a technical one that I do to doctors, but to talk about some of the philosophical, conceptual justification for why brain dead people are dead, because I think that's really the main controversy now. And it's based on this idea of the organism as a whole. And I put up as the reference this book by Jacques Loeb, who was a biologist at the University of Chicago and then the Rockefeller Foundation, now Rockefeller University. And he published a book 100 years ago this year called The Organism as a Whole. I took this book out of our library at Dartmouth. Our library goes back to the 18th century, and we've got a great collection of old books, although they're throwing them away now, unfortunately, as they're digitizing everything, but that's another matter. It was amazing to read the things that he said 100 years ago about this. It's not the whole organism. That is, it isn't the parts of the organism, but when the parts are working together in their normal ensemble, it creates functions that are not present or reproducible by any of the component parts. And it's responsible for the unity of the organism, the wholeness, the integrity, the oneness of the organism. One can look at the life of a cell, a tissue, an organ, or any way you want to parse the component parts. They have their own life. But what we're talking about in a determination of death is the whole. The organism is the finality of the whole. And I'm going to show, I hope, that brain dead patient is dead, but components of that person remain alive with technological support. But the whole is no more. And this turns on what are now referred to as emergent functions of the organism. And an excellent reference is the biophilosophy textbook by Manner and Bunge called Foundations of Biophilosophy. An emergent function is a function of a whole that is not present in any of the component parts. And they derive from these natural ensembles that when they are together doing their thing naturally create this new function that didn't exist before within any of the components. And there are hierarchies of these emergent functions, so that when cells get together, they have emergent tissue functions. When tissues get together, they have emergent organ functions. And when organs get together, particularly the brain, they have emergent functions of the organism as a whole. These emergent functions have been studied by a number of people who study complexity theory, such as the Santa Fe Institute, if anyone has read about some of their interesting work. And complex systems include things like the weather and so on. And they have these interesting equations and mathematical formulas to try to predict the function of complex systems. But even what we know about complex systems now can't predict, when these parts go together, how they create an emergent function. We don't know enough about it to be able to predict that. And this has also been used to study evolution with natural organization, so-called auto-organization. Anyway, human conscious awareness is the most exquisite example, as we know, an ineffable emergent function of the ensemble of distributed parallel hierarchical networks of brain neurons. That's nice to say that's what it is, but nobody has a clue how it works. Not any clue. It's little tiny parts of it are being studied, which is good, but the whole is not clear. Now, an important paper looking at what the organism as a whole means in the setting of brain death was published in an obscure journal in Vienna by Bonelli and colleagues in 2009, and hasn't really received the attention that it should. And they looked at this question from their perspective and said that life forms have certain criteria, dynamics such as metabolism, regeneration, growth, propagation, integration, where the life derives from the mutual interaction of component parts, coordination, in which the integration is conducted not randomly, but in an ordered way, and immanency, that is, that the characteristics originate from and are intrinsic to the life form. They are not extrinsic. And the criterion of an organism would include the life form ones plus completion. The organism is not a component part of another living entity, but it is itself an intrinsically independent and completed whole. And indivisibility, that no organism can be divided into more than one living organism, or if it is, and of course some single-celled organisms can be, the completed organism resides in one of the parts. The other two are self-reference. Life processes serve the self-preservation of the whole at the expense of the component parts, like one would amputate a gangrenous leg in order to keep the rest of the organism alive, and a person with an amputated leg still is functioning as an organism as a whole, even though he may not be a whole organism. And then finally, identity, where despite incremental changes in the form or gain-loss of component parts, the living being remains one and the same throughout life. And this is an important concept that goes back to the famous thought experiment the Greeks had of the ship of Theseus. If you one by one replace all the planks of the ship, is the new ship the same as the old ship? Is it the same ship? So, I mean, that's what that gets at. It's an old question. And then Bonelli and colleagues said that using that framework, the death of an organism is the loss of these essential characteristics. The loss of immanency, where life processes no longer spring from itself because it's the ventilator that is in charge. Loss of self-reference, where the parts no longer support the whole because there isn't a whole. So the fact that the heart is beating and the kidneys are filtering and making urine doesn't support the whole, which doesn't exist anymore. There's a loss of completeness and indivisibility. The components no longer comprise the whole. And these conditions are satisfied by the brain-dead human organism. So this is a brief review of some of the biophilosophical issues of why the brain-dead person is dead because of the cessation of function of the organism as a whole. Now, physicians We've talked a little bit about the definition and the criterion, and now the tests of death. The tests showing circulation and heartbeat, circulation, and breathing are useful in 99.9% of death determination, not complicated by cardiopulmonary support. So those are adequate because they go on to produce brain death. And the brain death tests are needed only when the ventilatory support is going on. And these tests must have no false positive determinations and as few false negatives as possible. This is a reproduction of a painting in the Wiertz Museum in Brussels, in which it's depicted the cholera epidemic that swept through Europe in the middle of the 19th century. And a lot of people were declared dead, including some who were just severely dehydrated and shock, and it depicts someone awakening in a coffin, and is, I think, important to remember that there are primal fears that everyone has that they'll be misdiagnosed as dead by a physician who isn't doing it right. This is a diagram of a specially equipped coffin that sold many thousands of units in the 19th century, where people could be buried in this thing underground with this bulb resting on the chest. And if there was breathing with excursion of the chest, why, it would push the bulb up and down and wave the flag and ring the bell. I'm not sure what happened on a windy day, maybe a lot of digging, but the point is that this was, people were afraid of this, and in the days before stethoscopes were invented, it wasn't that easy to hear heartbeat, and there were lots of cases of incorrect death determination. And Edgar Allan Poe, the American poet and short story writer, wrote quite a few short stories about this that were chilling. So the examination that's done, and I don't want to go through the medical parts of this, but just to make you know that we first have to know, physicians have to show that there's a structural lesion of the brain that accounts for the clinical findings. If somebody overdoses on a depressant medication and is in a coma from an overdose, and you do an MRI or a CT scan of the brain and it looks normal, that's not a brain death determination. That person needs to be in an intensive care unit and treated until they recover from their overdose. So there has to be a known structural brain lesion from a trauma, stroke, hemorrhage, meningitis, whatever it is, to account for the clinical findings. And it's essential to exclude all reversible causes. Anything that, if treated, might get better, this has to be shown to be irreversible. There must be, on examination, unresponsiveness to all stimuli, no response at all to anything. All the cranial nerves have to be absent, things like shining a light in the pupils, no response. Touching the eyes, cornea, no blink. No eye movements tested by reflexes that we do by infusing ice water into the external auditory canal. And apnea, that is loss of breathing, tested properly, as I said, by safely allowing the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to go up. Well, what are some of the medical controversies? I talked about the philosophical ones. There are also a set of medical ones. And we mentioned in the Europe study that some countries require at least 2 examinations, others require only 1. The United States has recently changed from a national recommendation for 2 to 1, but currently in a survey that was done looking at what doctors actually do in hospitals, the majority of them still use 2. And it just shows that some standard that has existed for many decades isn't going to get changed overnight by a new recommendation. So that's still a controversy. The value of ancillary tests or confirmatory tests like the ones that show an absence of blood flow, I think they're useful, others don't. The need for standardization, I think, isn't probably a controversy, but it is an issue. There are now therapeutic hypothermia protocols for patients who have suffered a cardiac arrest after a heart attack, collapse. There's a duration of time before they're resuscitated, and the brain has been exposed to minutes of lack of blood flow and lack of oxygen, and bringing them to the hospital cooling them down to this hypothermia, in some studies at least, seems to improve their outcome by reducing the demands of the brain so that the lack of that isn't cause quite as much damage. The problem, of course, is that much of the damage already has been done before they reach the hospital. Failure to accept by family members is an issue sometimes. Religious opposition by some religions can occur sometimes. And then some of the organ transplantation issues. And we don't really have time to get into all of these interesting things now, but I've discussed them in this paper and would be happy to answer a question about them if people are interested. So for future directions, I think that what the future of this holds, and I wrote a paper in the American Journal of Bioethics a couple of years ago called Whither Brain Death? Like, where's it going? What's happening with brain death? We need better education of medical personnel and the public. That's clear from survey after survey after survey that shows rampant misunderstanding. We need a better and more rigorous biophilosophical justification of the equivalence of brain death and human death, particularly, and this is what the medical student and I are working on, defining those emergent functions that are necessary and sufficient for the functioning of the organism as a whole. So that's not as easy as it sounds. Greater consensus on societally acceptable accommodations for those who do not accept brain death. There are a few states in the United States that have enacted religious exemptions due to the nature of the respect for religious beliefs in our country. Some states feel that if someone feels that it's against their religion and there's evidence for that, then they shouldn't be declared dead using that standard, only the circulatory respiratory standard. And that's already incorporated into some statutes of death. And the question is, when does this kind of everybody does their own way, libertarianism, if you will, when does it become chaotic and unworkable? An international standardization of practice criteria and a determination of the role of ancillary tests. So I thank you again very much for this kind invitation, and I'd be glad to sit up here and respond to questions.